Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. If you've not been here before, this is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and every week I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. Thank you so much for being here and for joining me for episode 7. If you are interested in Australian true crime and you love a channel that so far can't seem to find a regular schedule to stick to, then consider subscribing. Or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. But today's case is the horrible tragedy of the De Gruchy family massacre that occurred in New South Wales in the mid-90s. Now, this case involves the murder of most of a family, including a 13 and 15-year-old, which I know aren't like super young kids, but they are babies all the same. So if that's not your jam, I totally get it. Maybe meet me on the next one. This episode will also contain some graphic explanations and imagery concerning the murders, so again, totally understand if that's not your bag, baby. Now, just before we get into it, there was minimal information available about the family up until the murders, so just know that we don't have a ton of background, but I did what I could. Don't come for me, Kay, thanks. So that's probably enough disclaimers for now. Let's just jump into the case. On Wednesday the 13th of March 1996, just before 9 a.m, Steve Bailey was standing outside his Shearwater Boulevard house in Albion Park Rail, New South Wales. He noticed his neighbour from across the road, 18-year-old Matthew De Gruchy, out the front of his house looking super distressed and running around the street calling out for help. As Matthew got closer, Steve heard him say that there was something wrong with his mum and Sarah being his 13-year-old sister. Matthew had come home only half an hour beforehand after staying the night with his girlfriend Alyssa. Steve knew the De Gruchys. They had been neighbours for a long time. He knew Jennifer and her husband Wayne and the 3 children, Matthew, Sarah and Adrian. He also knew that Sarah had been diagnosed with epilepsy, and his immediate thought was that maybe Jenny was having trouble giving Sarah the medication that she needed, so he rushed over to help. Matthew was still yelling outside and calling for help when Steve entered number 28 to see if he could lend a hand. He noticed that Jenny's door was slightly open and he called out to her, but he got no reply. So he pushed open the door and went to see what was wrong. At first he thought it might be a prank. He saw that Jenny was still under her covers and he half expected her to jump out at him, giving him a fright. But when he pulled back the covers, he saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Jenny was lying in her bed, blood covering her head and upper body. She was not recognizable. He knew it was her because he was in her room, but she had been bludgeoned with so much force that there was no face left to recognize. Steve Bailey ran for the door. He could not get out of that house quickly enough. He called over to his wife's father to call the police and ambulance right away, and he stayed with the distraught Matthew until they came. Ambulance officers and police arrived at the quiet street, and the paramedics were approached by Matthew De Gruchy, distressed, crying, and in a state of shock, and he was immediately taken to hospital. Detective Sergeant Danny Sharkey walked into the house and went into the master bedroom, and he saw Jenny De Gruchy, dead, in her bed, still partially under the blanket that had covered her. He then walked through the house and opened the door to a second bedroom, where he found the deceased body of Matthew's 13-year-old sister, Sarah. He and his team continued to search the house, and when they went to the yard and opened a side door to the garage, they came upon the body of Matthew's 15-year-old brother, Adrian, lying on the garage floor. Jenny, Sarah, and Adrian had all been brutally bludgeoned to death. Their injuries were horrific. Jennifer De Gruchy had to be formally identified using blood samples because there wasn't enough left of her face to identify her by. She had fractures between her eyes, skull, cheekbones, and severe underlying brain trauma. Her head injuries had been so savage that her brain was almost forced all the way out of her skull. I told you it was graphic. Forensics officers noted that there weren't the usual pattern of blood splatter that would be seen in this type of attack, and this was also noticed in Sarah's room, where the young girl had suffered the same fate as her mother. Her skull had been fractured in many places along the forehead, right-hand side and base of her head, but close to Sarah's body was a cushion or pillow that did not belong in her room, with bloodstains on it. It was also found to have several cuts in it. Investigators realised that both Jenny and Sarah's faces had been covered by this pillow before the attacks had begun. Sarah was also found with a Walkman and a set of headphones next to her, which told the detectives that she most likely had been listening to music when the attack began on her mother and hadn't heard anything until it was too late. Out in the garage, the scene was a different story. 15-year-old Adrian De Gruchy had been working on building or repairing a wooden chair. The chair was upturned and there was a caulking gun with wood glue in it next to his body. His back had been turned to his attacker and Adrian had been struck over 20 times. The cast-off bloodstains showed that it was a frenzied, vicious attack, so violent that his blood was on the ceiling from the attacker's repeated blows. Whatever weapon had been used had been swung violently upwards before each hit and had cast off Adrian's blood onto the walls and the roof and everything else that was in the garage. Some of Adrian's teeth had been found on the floor, indicating the absolute ferocity of this attack. His face and skull were fractured, as well as his jaw and cheekbones. A blanket had been placed over the head and neck of Adrian after the attack, and it was also found to have several cuts in it. This attack on 3 members of the same family was so gruesome and horrific that one of the first attending officers to the house walked off the job that day and never came back. Jenny's husband and the children's father, Wayne, had been away in Sydney staying with his parents when police called to notify him of the tragedy that had occurred in their home. He left Sydney immediately and travelled back to Shoalhaven. His wife and 2 of his 3 children were gone. He was taken to the police station where he spoke with homicide investigator Belinda Neal. Coincidentally, it was Belinda Neal's very first day in the homicide unit, and this was the first call she had taken, and to this day was the worst murder she had ever witnessed. Matthew De Gruchy was giving a statement at the same time, having been released from the hospital after the gruesome discovery of his family. The 2 men were both fingerprinted, and they also willingly gave blood and DNA samples to the police to be able to clear them as suspects. Police had received reports that Wayne's dark-coloured Holden Commodore had been seen near the house at around 3 a.m, but Wayne De Gruchy maintained that he'd been in Sydney playing golf and staying with his parents. The police had questioned his parents and those people he said he was playing golf with, and they all confirmed that he'd been there. When police investigated the claims of his vehicle being spotted at the scene, they also discovered that Wayne's car had actually been involved in an accident a few days beforehand and had actually been at the mechanics at the time being repaired, so it must have been another vehicle that had been seen. The forensics teams had also placed the time of death for the victims at between 8 p.m. on the 12th of March and 1 a.m. on the 13th, due to the amount of rigor mortis and gravitational settling of the blood and the temperature of the bodies. So the time that the witnesses had seen a similar car to Wayne's was inconsistent with the times that the murders had happened. Wayne was cleared as a suspect, and he was finally able to grieve for his wife Jenny, his son Adrian, and his daughter Sarah. Matthew De Gruchy was still shaky after the discovery of his family, but he was able to make his statement to police. He'd come home from staying at his girlfriend's house at about 8:30 a.m. on the morning of March 13th. He'd left his wallet on the kitchen bench the night before, and he needed to buy some more cigarettes, so he'd run into the house, grabbed his wallet, and ran back out again. He'd gone down to the local store, he'd bought his smokes, and had returned home just before 9 a.m. When he'd come into the house the first time, he didn't notice anything strange, but when he came back into the house the second time, he realized it was quiet. It was too quiet. His brother and sister should be up. His mum would be up making breakfast or getting the other kids ready for school. He walked slowly back down the hallway and opened his mum and dad's bedroom door. His mother didn't respond when he called out to her, and then he noticed the blood. He realized something terrible had happened, and he ran outside, shaking and crying, calling to his neighbours for help. He saw Steve Bailey across the road and ran to him before almost passing out from shock and being taken to the hospital in the ambulance that Steve had called. The ambulance officers recalled that Matthew was hysterical. He was asking them over and over again what had happened and who would have done this to his family. On the day the bodies were found, and in the couple of days following the discovery, forensics had been poring over the De Gruchy house to try and uncover any clues, anything that might lead to the person that had committed these vicious and horrific crimes. In both Jennifer and Sarah's bedrooms, as I said before, there wasn't the usual pattern of blood spray that would be consistent with the types of injuries that both women had sustained. A pillow that had been found in Sarah's room actually belonged to one of the armchairs in the living room, and it did have her blood on it, so it was thought this had been held over her face while the attack had happened. And this was also the case with Jennifer. What did stand out to the forensic teams, though, was 2 or 3 small round spots of blood that were on the wall behind the beds in both Jenny and Sarah's bedrooms. If their faces had been covered during the attacks, these bloodstains should not have been there, and they didn't seem to have any real velocity to them, which told investigators that the small droplets of blood hadn't been flung onto the wall with force, which you would expect to see if they'd come from a weapon that was being used to bludgeon Sarah and Jenny. The investigators took samples of this blood, hoping that it might have come from a defensive wound that the attacker may have received. The injuries that all 3 victims had made the police think that the murder weapon was likely to be a sledgehammer or something similar, but no murder weapon was found anywhere at the scene. They also found smears of blood along with a left-hand palm print in the vanity of the main bathroom and other bloodstains in Jennifer and Wayne's ensuite bathroom. In Jennifer's room, apart from the small blood droplets, there was a large piece of her bedroom carpet that had been cut out from the floor near her bed, and another 2 small pieces that had been cut out near the door. If the killer had sustained wounds that night, they may have left blood or other DNA evidence on the floor and had cut out the pieces of carpet to remove that evidence. If this had been the case, then there was a good chance that the drops of blood on the wall came from the murderer. Inside the ensuite bathroom in the main bedroom, as well as those bloodstains, there was also a damp towel hung over the ensuite shower. Down the hallway leading back to the kitchen, detectives also noticed some light staining on the white tiled floor. Using a polylight, investigators found minute traces of blood in the staining. It looked as though someone had bled onto the tiles and tried to clean it up, but of course, the traces had still been there. Now, initially, robbery was not ruled out as a motivation. Matthew had provided police with a list of missing items from the home. Jennifer's purse was missing, and a few other items had been taken from the house. These items included things like computer games, a calculator, the VCR from the TV cabinet, a couple of videotapes, and some CDs. But robbery as a sole motive quickly became unlikely. There was no evidence of real ransacking throughout the home, and although the VCR was missing, other items like expensive jewelry and stereo systems and other valuables had been completely untouched. It gave investigators the feeling that the scene was maybe staged to look like a robbery, but they knew, just as well as we do, that people have killed for less. In the meantime, the forensic pathologist Dr. Alan Carla was conducting the post-mortem examinations on Jennifer, Sarah and Adrian De Gruchy. He noted that all 3 victims had a very similar wound pattern, and from the injuries and the amount of blood at the scene, he speculated that this was one assailant, and 1 to 2 murder weapons. The 3 family members had been subjected to a sustained attack, but in rapid succession. It was frenzied and it was excessively violent. The pathologist was known to have said that Jennifer, Sarah, and Adrian more resembled plane crash victims when they were brought in for autopsy. What Dr. Carla also noted was some unusual and distinctive bruising on Sarah's arms. Along her right arm was a long rectangular strip of bruising, as if she'd thrown up her arms to defend herself from the attack. Dr. Carla thought this may have been caused by a shaft or cylindrical type object, which fitted the detective's theory of a hammer. When Adrian's body was examined, the same bruising pattern was found over his chest, long linear bruising about 15 centimeters or 6 inches in length. But on the upper chest just below the collarbone was a distinctive circle-shaped bruise. The pathologist gave this information to police. They needed to figure out what sort of weapon could have not only caused the linear bruising, but also this circle bruise found on Adrian's chest. They were certain that Jennifer, Sarah, and Adrian had all been furiously attacked with a heavy metal object. A hammer was still on the list, but after many discussions and pattern testing, they also thought it could have been a wheel brace or lug wrench. They speculated that perhaps even both things could have been used. The first place the detectives went to look, of course, was Jennifer's car. Wayne had taken his work vehicle to Sydney and his other vehicle was in the shop being repaired, so this was the obvious place to see if they could find the wheel brace. The car was in the driveway, and when they popped the boot to look for the tools, they found that the compartment that usually held the jack and brace was already partially open. When they opened the compartment fully, the jack was still in place, but the jack handle and the wheel brace were missing. Investigators checked the spare tyre in the car and noticed that it still had the small beading on the outside rim of the tyre, which is called the flash, which meant that this spare tyre had never been on the road. This indicated to the detectives that there had never been an occasion where the tyre needed to be replaced, and so that told them that the jack would never have been used, which means it would never have been needed to be taken out of the compartment. They contacted the manufacturer and the seller of the vehicle, who both confirmed that this was the original spare tyre that had come with the car, and that the jack handle, and wheel brace were all present when the car was sold to the De Gruchys. They were able to obtain a similar wheel brace to the one that would have been supplied with the vehicle when Jenny and Wayne had purchased it, and it was consistent with the injuries on both Sarah and Adrian's bodies. The police and investigators were desperate to find the murder weapon. The De Gruchy home backed onto Lake Illawarra, and an extensive search was made of the grassland and backwater that was behind their backyard. Police enlisted the help of the New South Wales Fire Brigade and the Special Emergency Services, but after days of searching, they had found nothing. While the search was being conducted, Jennifer's car was taken to the police compound for a forensic examination. Understandably, all of the family's fingerprints were found on the vehicle, which told detectives nothing. It had been regularly used, and they had expected to find them. One thing they did not expect to find, though, was a small fibre on the floor of the back of the car behind the driver's seat. It was not consistent with any of the material that was fitted to the vehicle, but the detectives noticed that it was the exact same colour of the carpet in Jennifer's bedroom, which had had pieces cut out of it. They sent the fibre and a sample of the carpet to be tested, and the results indicated that this fibre matched the carpet sample from Jennifer's bedroom. The post-mortem of Adrian De Gruchy had also uncovered skin peeling on his left side, and this had been caused by gasoline. Petrol had been poured on the body after the attack. The investigators at the house had noticed a red jerry can in the garage with the lid open, and there was only a small amount of gas left in it. It seemed like the attacker had actually planned to maybe set Adrian's body alight, but had only gone so far as to pour gas over it, which had caused Adrian's skin to peel off, after having been left there with the petrol over the side of his body overnight. The jerry can was bagged as evidence and sent to the lab to examine it for prints. The blood samples from the home and other physical evidence had also been sent to forensic teams, and the investigators waited for the results while they continued their investigation. In the lab, the forensics team were able to get clear fingerprints from the jerry can. They hadn't needed any enhancement and were clearly visible on the underside of the handle. The fingerprint analysis showed that the prints belonged to one Matthew De Gruchy. This wasn't damning evidence, though. The jerry can had been used for the family cars, and Matthew had frequently used them to fill up the tanks with petrol if and when required. It was, however, a concern that the fingerprints were so clear and that no other prints had been found on the container, which indicated that Matthew had been the last person to use it. And there were also no smudges in the prints, which also indicated that no one else, even perhaps wearing gloves, had picked it up, or at least not by the handle. The blood found throughout the hallway behind Jennifer and Sarah's beds and the bloody palm print in the main bathroom, however, also matched Matthew De Gruchy, Jennifer and Wayne's oldest son and brother to both Sarah and Adrian. Was it possible that the 18-year-old had committed this violent, vicious attack on his own family? And if not, how did his blood and prints get there? Matthew had told detectives that he'd spent the night at his girlfriend's house on the 12th, so they needed to interview her. 16-year-old Alyssa Brindley was called into the police station for an interview. She told detectives that she and Matthew had spoken over the phone at about 8 p.m. on the night of the 12th of March, and they had arranged that he would come over and stay at her house. He had told her that he would be heading over shortly and that he wouldn't be too long. So she waited for Matthew to show up, but he didn't. She called the De Gruchy home at about 10:30 p.m. to check if he was still planning to come over, but nobody answered. She assumed that he'd just changed his mind or something had come up, so feeling pretty damn annoyed but also pretty damn tired, she went to bed. She woke up though when she heard knocking at her window and front door between 11 and 11:30 p.m. It was Matthew. She had expected him almost 3 hours beforehand, and she was obviously frustrated. She'd been trying to call him after he just hadn't shown up, so she asked him what had happened. According to Alyssa's interview, she told the police that Matthew had told her his mother had asked him to stay home for a while because they had been receiving some prank phone calls that night. He had told Alyssa that one of the prank phone calls, a voice had told him that 3 of his family members would be dead. Like, okay, so if you walked in the next morning and found 3 of your family members had been killed, wouldn't the first thing that you told police be that someone had called the night before threatening to kill 3 members of your family? But Matthew had never once mentioned this to police or investigators in the days since the murders. It's one of the first things that he told Alyssa, though, when he arrived at her house. When detectives asked Alyssa if she could see any wounds or other marks on Matthew that evening, she told them that she hadn't seen anything. He wasn't bleeding, he had no scratches or other wounds that she could see. She told them that he seemed perfectly normal, relaxed, and his usual self. They asked Alyssa about Matthew's family life, if he ever argued with his parents. She told them that the only thing that they'd ever really seriously fought about was the car. Matthew had racked up a lot of kilometres on his mother's car, and they'd fought regularly about his use of it. So much so that they had decided that Matthew would only be able to use his father's work vehicle from now on, and would not be allowed to joyride around in his mum's car anymore. After interviewing Alyssa, detectives made a request for the phone records for the De Gruchy number for the night of March the 12th. They did see a few calls come into the house that night, but when they managed to contact the numbers that had rung, they were calls made to Jennifer from Wayne, letting the family know that he'd be staying in Sydney for the night. There was one from her mother checking in. There was an outgoing call from Jennifer to her brother Raymond, and there was the call from Alyssa to Matthew at around 8 p.m. There were no calls received at the De Gruchy house from any unknown people or any unknown numbers. 4 days after the discovery of Jennifer, Adrian and Sarah De Gruchy dead in their home, Detective Sergeant Sharkey and his team brought Matthew De Gruchy back in for questioning. The first thing he was questioned about were the calls that were apparently made to his house by a prank caller, which was the reason that he'd arrived at Alyssa's house so late. Matthew told the detectives in this interview that there had been a few calls to the home, but that when he'd picked them up, all he could hear was the beeping of the disconnect tone. Each time he'd picked up on one of the prank calls, the person on the other end must have already hung up. He never once mentioned any threats to the lives of his family. Sharkey continued to ask Matthew if there was any time between him picking up the phone and the caller hanging up, and Matthew could only confirm that each time he would pick up the phone and only hear the beeping. For Matthew's claim to Alyssa to have been true, the call had to have connected, and he actually had to have heard someone on the other line telling him that 3 of his family members were going to die, but in this interview he maintained that the calls had hung up each time he'd answered the phone. If the calls had connected even for a second, they would have shown up on the phone records, but detectives could find no such instances of anything like this on the telephone records that they had obtained. They went back through Matthew's initial statement to police, where he told them about coming home to discover the bodies of most of his family. He confirmed that he had forgotten to take his wallet to Alyssa's house, so he'd stopped quickly at the home at about 8:30 a.m. and run in to grab it. He hadn't noticed anything because he was only in the house for a minute. He grabbed his wallet and went down to the local store where he bought some cigarettes and then came back home. He noticed how quiet it was when he'd gotten back into the kitchen, and he'd started down the hall where he, quote, sort of hit Sarah's door but just didn't really worry about it. He opened his mother's bedroom door and in his own words, quote, realised about me mum. Matthew told detectives that he broke down. He didn't know what had happened to his mother. He ran outside, saw Steve Bailey across the road and called out to him for help. The detectives then asked a series of seemingly unimportant questions. Did he go to the lounge room? Matthew said that he hadn't. They asked if he went to the dining room. Matthew said no. They asked if he'd been back to the kitchen. He said no. And then they asked him, did you go to or into your sister's bedroom? And Matthew said no. While these questions may have seemed standard and innocent enough to Matthew, they were a big clue to detectives. When his neighbour Steve Bailey spoke to the police, he distinctly remembered the anxious, crying, shaking Matthew running across the street to him, yelling that there was something wrong with Mum and Sarah. Steve remembered this because he thought it might have something to do with Sarah's epilepsy condition. Sarah's door was closed, and Matthew had just confirmed that he'd never been in there. He'd never seen her. So how did he know that something was wrong with Sarah? And if he was just assuming that something was wrong with everyone in the house, why didn't he mention Adrian? They then questioned Matthew about the use of his mother's car. He confirmed that he had driven Jenny's car to Alyssa's house that night. They asked Matthew if he ever argued with his mother about using the car, and he told police that he wouldn't call them arguments. There were times where she didn't want him to use it, but he wouldn't go as far to say that they'd actually fought about it. They asked Matthew if he'd ever threatened or assaulted his mother at any time for any reason, but particularly over the use of the vehicle. Matthew denied that he ever had. Now, Alyssa had already told the police that she knew he'd frequently gotten into arguments with his mum about using the car, and on the night of the 12th, this would have been the only vehicle at the home. Detective Sharkey concluded this interview and allowed Matthew to leave the police station. Matthew De Gruchy had become the prime suspect for the murder of his siblings and his mother. His blood had been found in the home in both his mother's and Sarah's rooms and in the hallway. He was at home for the majority of the window that the forensics team had placed the times of death. He had somehow known that something had happened to Sarah without ever even seeing her or entering her room. His clear fingerprints were on the jerry can, and he was the last person to have used Jennifer's car, where a fibre matching her bedroom carpet had been found, and where the wheel brace was missing, which matched the pattern of bruising on all of the victims. This small fibre, once it had been linked to the master bedroom carpet, had actually been sent for further testing. Dr. Robert Goetz, a senior forensic biologist, had been sent the small 3-centimetre carpet fibre from the vehicle. When he examined it, he noticed a small red-brown stain on one end, which he confirmed to be blood. A small amount of the fibre that contained the blood was cut off and tested against DNA samples on file, and it was matched to only one person, Matthew De Gruchy. The bloody palm print that had been found in the vanity of the main bathroom was also matched to Matthew De Gruchy. On the 22nd of March, the funeral and memorial service was held for Jennifer, Adrian, and Sarah. Matthew was a pallbearer alongside his father and cried as he carried the coffins through the procession. His father stood by his side, convinced of Matthew's innocence, but other members of his family were not so sure. The police were fairly certain that Matthew had committed these vicious, appalling attacks on his own family, but with little in the way of physical evidence, they did not have what they needed to charge him or to prove it. All of the evidence that they did have was purely circumstantial, and officers wouldn't have what they needed to arrest Matthew for another couple of months. In the weeks following the discovery, Jennifer's sister Liz Karhoff had helped get the family home in a state where it could be lived in again, so that her brother-in-law, Wayne De Gruchy, could still live in it. And I have no idea how hard it would be to live in a house where your partner and your children had been brutally murdered. Matthew obviously felt that way too, because he'd been spending a lot of time at his girlfriend Alyssa Brindley's house. 2 months after Jennifer, Adrian, and Sarah De Gruchy had been found viciously attacked and murdered in their own home, the police received information that would move the investigation out of the stalemate that it was in. It came to the attention of police in May of 1996 that a group of young boys had been riding their bikes at a local quarry, and this quarry also had a dam. Terry Williams, who was 16 at the time, said that they had visited the quarry on a few occasions, but that this time they were going to attempt a sick jump into the water in the dam. The group rode their bikes up to the top of a ledge to get a better look at the landscape and figure out the best way to go about the stunt. When they got to the top of the ledge and looked back at the water, they noticed something in the water near the bank. They could see that it was red, but they weren't sure what it was, just that it definitely didn't belong there. They dropped their bikes and ran down to see what it was. One of Terry's friends waded into the shallow bank and pulled out a large red sports bag from the water. The rest of the group rushed forward, curious as to what was inside the bag. It was heavy, and there might have been something cool in there, so they were anxious to open it and find out. When they unzipped the bag, they found some papers, a couple of large bits of carpet, and a small sledgehammer wrapped in a towel. The boys took the sledgehammer out of the bag and placed it in the grass nearby, and then zipped the bag back up and threw it back into the dam. One of the boys had gone back to the dam at a later date and moved the hammer behind a tree before reporting the discovery to police. As soon as the detectives got this important information, they had the dam completely drained and went about searching for this evidence and anything else that may have been dumped there. What they found in the dam included a couple of other bags, Jennifer's purse still containing her ID and other cards, Adrian's calculator, the VCR from the family home, a large piece of carpet that matched the piece that had been cut out of Jennifer De Gruchy's bedroom floor, a towel, a knife, a pair of scissors, some videotapes, a bottle of Zambuca, some computer games, a handkerchief, and some clothing, tracksuit pants and t-shirts. And of course, the sledgehammer, which had been obtained by police but contained no blood or DNA evidence after spending 2 months submerged in the water. Every single thing that Matthew had so meticulously detailed as being missing from the house had been found in the dam, either inside the bags or sitting at the bottom in the silt. But there was one more item that had been found in that water that was to become the biggest piece of evidence in the triple murder case so far. It was a small Ziploc bag. Inside this plastic resealable bag was a number of band-aids and about 30 small pieces of torn-up paper. The paper had visible writing on it. It was a note that had been ripped up and for some reason had been put into this Ziploc bag. These torn-up pieces of paper were sent to Document Examiner Senior Sergeant Rick Mesker for analysis. The paper had been sitting in a dam for 2 months, and although it was in a resealable bag, it had still become wet from the moisture that had seeped into the bag over time. Mesker noticed that some of the ink had bled into the paper, but he was still able to reconstruct the document, which it turned out was a list. It looked to investigators like a to-do list. It's hard to make out some of the writing, but it reads like this: open gate, throw bottle down back, throw things down the wall, roof, tracksuit pants 1, knife 1, t-shirts 2, shoes 2, hanky 1, pole, towel, open blinds to see through, Sarah, mum, Adrian, headbutt bench, have shower, throw hi-fi down back, hit arm with pole, hit leg with pole, cut somewhere with knife. This list was a twisted checklist of how to possibly get away with murder, and Rick Mesker, being the document examiner, was also a handwriting expert, and take one guess as to whose handwriting this matched. If you guessed Matthew De Gruchy and that was your final answer, then congratulations, you're correct, A+ for you. The handwriting was confirmed to be that of Matthew De Gruchy. This was the vital piece of evidence that investigators had been hoping to find, but they also needed to make sure that the timeline fit. Could Matthew have murdered his family, set up the crime scene as a burglary, including cutting out the carpet and wiping away his own blood from the hallway, drive to the quarry and dam to dump the evidence, and arrive at Alyssa's house in around 3 hours? The quarry and dam were actually only a very short distance from Alyssa Brindley's home. The investigators tested these distances at different speeds, and detectives reasoned that there would have been time for Matthew to do all of these things, even to have taken the shower that was noted in this list, remembering that there was blood and a damp towel found in the ensuite bathroom. On the 23rd of June 1996, Matthew was arrested for viciously murdering his own mother, brother, and sister. Matthew De Gruchy's trial wouldn't be held until 2 years later on the 23rd of September 1998. He pleaded not guilty to the slaughter of most of his family. Throughout the trial, his father, his girlfriend Alyssa Brindley, and her mother Gail all testified that Matthew was a gentle person. He was far from violent. He was devoted to his mother. He was quiet, polite, and kind. On cross-examination, though, Alyssa revealed that although she did think these things about Matthew, he did drink often. He smoked marijuana, and he and his mother did often get into arguments about his excessive use of her car, which had resulted in him not being allowed to borrow the vehicle and being made to use his father's work vehicle when it was available. The prosecution outlined the multitude of circumstantial evidence against Matthew, including the fact that the way in which the victims were killed indicated a personal nature, or that the attacker was someone that the victims knew intimately. The note that had been found in the dam was a key piece of evidence in their case. It was matched to Matthew's handwriting, and it read like a checklist of things to do that might make it seem like he had escaped an attacker and how he planned to get rid of the evidence. Matthew testified that he didn't remember writing the list, but did concede that it was his handwriting. He said that he thought it was a birthday list from his 18th birthday that had been in December of 1995. The prosecution argued that some of the items on this list had no place on a birthday wish list or checklist, things like cut somewhere with knife or hit arm and leg with pole. The defense had actually argued that the roof, walls and back of the house were searched, so even if Matthew did write this list, the steps on it weren't taken, so it wasn't proof that he'd done anything. They also questioned why, if he had written this list to stage a murder, would he have put the torn up pieces of the note into a plastic Ziploc bag to preserve them. The prosecution pointed out the fact that he may have run out of time to complete the things on the list and wanted to distance himself from the crime instead of making it look like he'd escaped it. There was no bottle or hi-fi system thrown down the back, but both a bottle of Sambuca and the VCR unit were both found at the dam. They did not address, however, why he would have preserved the list after tearing it up, except perhaps by accident. Matthew's testimony at trial is that he had stayed behind for a while on the night of the 12th of March because his mother, not him, had received threatening phone calls in which the person on the other end had said that 3 of his family members would die. He didn't know why these calls would not have been on the phone records that had been obtained by the investigators. When confronted about the fibre of carpet found in his mother's vehicle with his blood on it, he told the court that his family had actually recently hired a carpet cleaning machine, and his father confirmed this as well. When they had finished cleaning the carpets, they had used an offcut from the carpeting from the house that had been kept in the garage, and they'd put that down in the boot of his mother's car before placing the machine on top of it, and it was reasonable that that's how the similar fibre to the master bedroom carpet had come to be in the car. He said that the blood that was found in the house and on that carpet may have been from a previous incident. He had, after all, cut himself accidentally before, and the defence also relied on Alyssa, her mother, and Matthew's neighbour Steve Bailey, who all testified that they did not notice any wounds or injuries on Matthew at all on the night of the 12th and morning of the 13th of March. The prosecution stated that it was possible, if under enough stress, for a spontaneous nosebleed to occur, and murdering 3 members of your own family would definitely have been considered a pretty stressful situation. They offered no other explanation of how Matthew's blood had been found in so many instances around the house, suffice to say that it was his blood. The prosecution speculated that on the night of the 12th of March, Matthew De Gruchy had argued with his mother over her not allowing him to use her car to drive to Alyssa's house, and that this argument had enraged him to the point where he murdered his own family. There was no real evidence of this as a motive, and the defence used this fact, as well as the unchallenged testimony by members of Matthew's family that he was gentle and kind in nature and not a violent person, to make the case that this crime may have been committed by a total stranger. They even at one point hinted to the fact that maybe his father had committed the murders. It was mentioned a few times at trial that Wayne had a girlfriend in Sydney that he'd also been seeing while he was there, and while he did stay with his parents, he went to bed at 10:30 p.m. He could have driven the hour and a half back to the family home, killed his family, and then driven the hour and a half back, which was a huge stretch. But even despite this claim, Wayne De Gruchy stood by his son, professing his innocence. The other piece of information they pointed out is that there were strands of hair found in Adrian De Gruchy's hand when he was found, that did not match Matthew. It was also found to be much longer than Adrian's hair, so it was also unlikely to be his. The prosecution argued that just because there wasn't strong proven evidence of a motive doesn't mean there wasn't one. anything could have happened in the house that night, and there must have been a reason that Matthew was over 3 hours late to his girlfriend's house. Proof of motive is not required in a criminal case. Courts and juries may be really curious as to why someone would commit a crime, but their job is only to determine whether that person committed the crime. Sometimes people do things without a why, or without a why that's super evident. As for the hair found in Adrian's hand, when tested, it was found that the DNA material matched either Adrian or Sarah or both. Now, that DNA material was actually blood that was found in the hair. The hair was too contaminated to actually get a DNA profile. But if they were killed with the same weapon, it is possible that Sarah's hair and DNA could have been transferred to Adrian when he was likely fighting for his life whilst being bludgeoned to death. The other very interesting part of the trial is 2 other murders that happened in 1998. You guys might have heard of the Mark Valera case. He was a young man, 19 years old, who brutally murdered and mutilated 2 men, David O'Hearn and Frank Arkell, in June of that year, and he was arrested during the De Gruchy murder trial. The defence for Matthew De Gruchy claimed that there were similarities between these 2 murders and the murders of the De Gruchy family, and the defence team had attempted to subpoena the police interviews and records relating to the Valera murders. One of the Valera victims, David O'Hearn, lived in the same suburb as the De Gruchys, less than 2 kilometres or just over 1 mile away from their home. Mark Valera had also attended the same school as Matthew, Adrian and Sarah. Was it possible that there were 2 teenage murderers in the same suburb, or was it more likely that there was only one? The defence team, though, was denied the material that they had requested. The similarities that they had noted basically stopped at there were people murdered. The murder of the De Gruchy family was violent and horrific, but the amount of mutilation and brutality regarding the Valera victims was on another level. It included decapitation, torture, dismemberment, and other atrocities. And they were also committed over 2 years after the De Gruchy murders, and Mark Valera, previously known as Mark Van Crevel, walked into the police station and handed himself in, claiming that both of his victims had propositioned him for sexual acts. The judge felt like there were not enough links between these 2 murders and the De Gruchy family murders to even entertain the possibility that Mark Valera had committed all of them. The defence and the prosecution summed up their cases, and on the 13th of October 1996, at just after 10 a.m, the jury retired to deliberate. Over the course of the next 6 hours, the jury requested reviews of Alyssa and Gail Brinley's statements, and the court testimony transcripts of both Detective Senior Constable Gary Moffat of the Fingerprint Unit and Dr. Robert Goetz, the Senior Forensic Biologist. By 4 p.m, after deliberating for 6 hours, the jury had still not reached a verdict. Instead of trying to continue into the evening, they decided that they would return the following day to try and reach a unanimous decision. The case against Matthew was circumstantial, and the defence had raised a couple of good points, but the evidence that Matthew had committed these crimes was overwhelming. There were just too many coincidences. And so on the 14th of October 1998, the jury returned their verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. It was noted that Matthew showed zero emotion when the verdict was handed down. He remained stoic and stone-faced, and this had been his demeanour throughout the entire trial. Before sentencing, Liz Karhoff, Jennifer De Gruchy's sister, made her victim impact statement. She said that when she saw Adrian's body, she had to cover her mouth to stop herself from screaming. His injuries were that horrific. She had gone back to the house to help clean it so that Wayne could live there, and she told the court that it took her over 6 hours to clean her sister and niece's blood from their bedrooms, and it was one of the most painful days of her entire life. The murders had changed her and put strain on her family life and all of her personal relationships, and she found it difficult to trust anyone. The community, family, and police officers were shocked that even though Matthew De Gruchy had been found guilty of the brutal murders of 3 of his own family members, he was only given a sentence of a minimum of 21 and a maximum of 28 years. He was given 3 of these sentences, but they were to be served concurrently, not one after the other. And this was due to taking into account Matthew's age at the time and his propensity for rehabilitation. Matthew De Gruchy was sent to Long Bay Jail, where he filed at least 2 appeals on the grounds that there was no physical evidence tying him to the murders, but all of his applications for appeal were denied. In 2017, after his minimum 21 years, Matthew began applying for parole. He was 39. He'd been approved already for day work release and had been working in an abattoir in Junee in New South Wales. But at his parole hearing that year, the State Parole Authority released a statement that said that the offender presents an unacceptable risk to the community, and he'd also not completed the required external leave programs. The statement also said that he would require a psychiatric report and confirmation of post-release accommodation, which he didn't have. 2 years later, though, in April of 2019, it seemed that the parole authority had just changed his mind about the level of risk to the community, and they officially formed an intention to grant parole. His father, Wayne, who had moved to Tasmania during Matthew's sentence, had said that he would help support Matthew after being released. Some of the officers who attended the crime scene and some of his own family members feared for not only their own safety, but for the safety of the community, and thought that he should be in prison for life. They also think that he's a sociopath, and there's not really any rehabilitation from that. There are a lot of offenders out there that got far more jail time for far less of a crime. Either way, on August 15th, 2019, Matthew De Gruchy was officially released from prison after serving only 23 years for the vicious triple murder of his own mother, brother, and sister. He's not permitted any contact for any of his mother's family members, nor is he allowed to enter Shoalhaven or Illawarra. It was rumoured that he had moved to Sydney. He is permitted to have contact with his father, who has believed that he's innocent for the entire time. He's out there now, somewhere, living his life, while his mother, brother, and sister's lives were all cut tragically short. Matthew De Gruchy has never confessed to the crime, and there are people out there that do believe that he's innocent, but plenty more that think that he is 100% guilty. I think he did it. I honestly think that he is guilty as sin, and I don't care if you didn't ask for my opinion, you're getting it anyway because this is my channel and I'll do what I want on it. But I don't think that there's any doubt in my mind that he did it, and I think he should have gotten life for it. So if you guys are so inclined, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think that this might have been some stranger that just happened to murder all 3 De Gruchy families and then only steal a purse and a VCR that they then just threw into the dam 25 minutes away from Matthew's house but only 2 minutes away from Melissa's? Or do you think the investigators got it right? Tell me what you think. But guys, that's it. That is the case of the De Gruchy family massacre. Matthew De Gruchy, as I said, is in Sydney somewhere now, I guess. He was only released 18 months ago, so I assume he's still there. I couldn't find anything to say if he'd moved or changed his name or anything like that, so yeah, that's all I got for you. The end. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So I hope to see you on the next episode, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.